evening. Welcome to the panel discussion based on the film Shared Legacies, the African American Jewish Civil Rights Alliance. I am assuming that we have moved over into the other format, and so we will begin. I hope I'm correct with this. I hope many of you have had the chance to view this remarkable film. While much of the information in it dates from my lifetime, seeing it again and viewing it in the context of what has been going on in the United States now brought a new life and meaning to the civil rights movement and the African American Jewish Civil Rights Alliance. One of the main points of the film is that it is difficult to go it alone. The program this evening highlights has been sponsored by many organizations: NCJW Chicago North Shore, Open Communities, JCC Chicago, Jewish Film Festival, NCJW South Cook, Rainbow Push Coalition, Independent Voters of Illinois Independent Precinct Organization, Congregation Sukkot Shalom, Chicago Women Take Action, the Decalogue Society of Lawyers, League of Women Voters of Chicago, KAM Isaiah Israel, and Congregation or Shalom. If this doesn't convince you that alliances and coalitions are the road to go, I don't know what will. These organizations have many diverse causes and many differences, but what is especially important is that there are many places they can and do come together, with civil rights and coalition building standing out. The panel for this evening was chosen with care. We have leaders in a variety of sectors: filmmaking as social activism, religious leadership, fair housing, voters' rights, volunteerism, social and legal causes, education. From these areas, we have found experts who care and were eager to share. We have the lead film writer and director, Sherry Rogers, a leader who has a significant role in the film and is with us from Atlanta, Sherry Frank, a leader in the area of fair housing, Chris Reelman, the Reverend Dr. Jeanette Wilson, who leads from her pulpit and is an activist and leader in voting rights, Rudy Garrett, and I, Nancy Burrows, the moderator, who have been an active volunteer, educator, and proponent of business ownership and career pathways in the workplace. We will lead you this evening from the past to the present to the future. We want you to come away with answers, with questions, with actions you individually and collectively feel ready to take on. Now, a few housekeeping rules before we get started. Please, audience, remain on mute. We will be taking questions posed in the chat section. I will be asking the panelists your questions. We may not get to all of them, and we may combine some of them. Once again, please remain muted. To begin with, let's start with the film writer and director, Sherry Rogers. I've had the pleasure of speaking with Sherry Rogers a few times. Each time, I come away more impressed and more enthusiastic. Sherry, I know that one of the questions we all have is, what caused you to write the film, and when did you actually write it?
Thank you so much. And Nancy, it's been a pleasure to talk to you and work with your community, and so honored, truly, and especially with NCJW. That is such an amazing organization. I had the privilege of Sherry Frank, who's on our panel, allowing us to film a wonderful NCJW event in Atlanta with Congressman John Lewis. And it was so extraordinary to see all the women in the country really standing around him and just appreciating what a gift he was to our country. So it's just an honor always to have Sherry Frank a part of any panel I'm on, because she is truly a gift to all of us as an amazing community bridge builder, and so blessed. But thank you for the question. It's really a two-part series.
Sherry, you got me muted.
Oh, did you hear what I said before?
Yes, we did.
Okay, I'm sorry. All right. I'm from Detroit, Michigan, and there's a wonderful African American museum here, the Charles Wright Museum. And I met a Stanford professor here that you see in the movie. His name is Clarence B. Jones, who just turned 90 years old. He was chosen by Claiborne Carson at Stanford University to represent Dr. King's inner mind, because he was his legal advisor, draft speechwriter, and counsel. He had written a book, What Would Martin Say? And one of the chapters was on anti-Semitism. So we developed a friendship, and we had realized that there was no films really on this topic, on the Black Jewish Coalition. And he personally had promised Dr. King that he would remind folks of the 24/7 commitment that the Jewish people had to their struggle. And as a part of this filming, I was in Atlanta and had the privilege of meeting Sherry Frank. She was already extremely involved in Black Jewish relations and as a part of the American Jewish Committee. And she had really invited us in to really meet the most important civil rights leaders in Atlanta. So she joined us on many of the interviews, including Ambassador Young and Senator Warnock now, and and of course, Congressman John Lewis.
Thank you. And when did you actually write this? How long ago was it?
We started really at the end of 2014, and we started filming in Washington, and then it was the 50th anniversary from the Selma to Montgomery March. And at the time, especially given that there was a Black president, President Obama, that I would say most of the civil rights leaders that were still alive gathered in Selma. So we started filming in Selma, and as you see in the film, Joanna Jackson's home, which is an amazing museum now, and she dedicates a good portion of her home to Rabbi Joshua Heschel, who stayed there overnight. And when she had called Susanna Heschel to come stay there, and we were able to film there, and Bernice King was there, and it was extraordinary.
Sounds it. What has been the response to the film?
Well, the most exciting response to the film is that it's being used as a tool to build bridges, to continue this important conversation. And what the film, I think, one of the most important things of the film that it does is these are the personal eyewitness recollections to that history. And as you can see, sadly, as blessed memory, we have Congressman John Lewis now, who has passed away, and Reverend C.T. Vivian. And while Congressman Lewis, Sherry Frank will tell you best about their work in Black Jewish relations, nobody had ever asked Reverend C.T. Vivian about this history. You know, he has so much going on that needed to be worked on racism and in the Black community, but he told me, no one ever asked him. I'm talking about Reverend Vivian, C.T. Vivian, about the Jewish people. So we spent days with him. Wow. And so the reaction, I think, is very positive, because, as you know, memory is very important. And memory sparks us to be more involved with working in coalition today. And historically, we didn't, get along in every area from what when we took testimony, but we still had enough in common that we accomplished amazing goals together. And hopefully it will spark folks today to work together on important areas that need to be worked on in coalition.
Thank you, Sherry. I know that for me, hearing people telling their stories really brought the film to life and the issues to life. I can't imagine if we couldn't have heard some of these people actually talking. And you and I spoke today briefly, and it leads to this question: what might have happened if you had waited to write this film, both about the people and some of the events that have occurred since 2014 when you got started? So what might have happened had you waited?
Well, first of all, I don't even, this movie, well, this particular movie wouldn't have been made. That's for sure. Especially since COVID happened. And Sherry Frank definitely motivated me. We had interviewed a lot of young folks as well. And I don't know, maybe Sherry must have had something in her gut who knew that, we needed to get this film out, because it's not just for entertainment purposes. It was really, there was a need as a need to educate on Black-Jewish relations, and to get, as Dr. Clarence Jones would say, the lions. The lions needed to tell their stories, so the hunters don't get all the credit. And there's so, and I hope you all read Sherry Frank's book, where she tells about her own lioness story related to her work in Black-Jewish relations. So I hope I'd like to hear from Sherry Frank and some of the other people on the panel here, because you saw our film, but these folks are the ones who really did the work.
Thank you. Thank you. And with that, I have some more questions for you, but later on we will ask some of those. So I'd like to move on now to some of the background that is shown in the film. And you're right, Sherry, that there is no one better to address this than Sherry Frank. So Sherry Frank, we're turning to you now. We know that you've been involved in this for decades, not just years, but decades. And not just involved, but you've also been an important leader in the Alliance. What are some of the foundations of the Jewish connection to the civil rights movement? And can you explain also how Tikkun Olam fits in?
Well, I've always said personally, what drives me is living out Judaism and helping repair the world and bring the world closer to peace. So clearly my Jewish values moved me. I think Jewish values of many civil rights leaders, Jews in the movement, were moved by a commitment to social justice. And also a shared legacy of bigotry and being on the outside. I've often said, if the world isn't safe for Blacks, it won't be safe for Jews. And if it's not safe for Jews, it won't be safe for Blacks. I mean, we both are the first to be the subject of bigotry. But there's a shared history of, decades ago, there were signs that no Blacks or Jews, were dogs allowed in this community, or Blacks and Jews and Catholics. I mean, there were things to do to bring the world more inclusive and more just. And a lot of it really also came from religious tradition. I mean, the role of the church, the role of the synagogue, the role of clergy, the role of rabbis was key. I mean, it was a huge role of lawyers as well. But the Exodus story, we were slaves and are singing around the Seder table, let my people go. I remember even in our coalition days, working for the release of Mandela and working for the release of Sharansky, and, a Soviet Jew and an anti-apartheid activist in South Africa. So through decades, there have just been things that bring us together. In Atlanta, it was civil rights and voting rights, but today there are other issues that continue to bring us together.
Thank you. One of the things that's very exciting is your background with some of these leaders. You're not being at all haughty or anything when you call Andrew Young Andy. It just flows naturally, and I loved it. But could you? We all love some stories.
Yeah,
Could
I'll give you some
share
personal ones.
background
So,
with some of these
right.
shakers?
So, I'll start with Andy Young. One of my, childhood friends was Stuart Eisenstadt, who went on to be, in the Carter White House, the Clinton White House. And when he was involved with Andy Young's campaign for Congress, I was working with them, and I said, "What can I do?" And I signed up to drive people to the polls on election day, and drove in a tough Black neighborhood with signs on my car and waited for buses to come at the end of the day for people to get off work, and drove them all over, God's country in Atlanta streets I'd never been on to vote. So that kind of started, my relationship. Today, I work with Andy's daughter, Andrea Young, who's doing a great job being chair of the ACLU of Georgia. With John Lewis, in 1982 or 84, the voting rights was up for renewal, and we pulled together Blacks and Jews to build a coalition around working on renewal of the Voting Rights Act. Because of all John's work with voter registration, we asked him to speak, and there was just electricity in the room. Blacks and Jews were so glad to be at the table, breaking bread together and wanting to stay together. And we said on the spot, can we form a coalition today? John, will you be the chair? And Cecil Alexander, an activist Jew, was kind of running the meeting, introducing Congressman Lewis, and he said he'd be the chair, so the coalition was born. But I quickly became close to Congressman Lewis. At that time, he was a member of City Hall in Atlanta, City Council, and I got close to his wife, and I believe that relations have to be personal if they're really going to be sustained. And I got close to his wife and realized that my young son, my fourth child, his only child, were born on the same day. And when they were 8 years old, Lillian Lewis and I had their birthday parties together. Oh. And when John ran for Congress, I said, the AJC closes at 2 on Shabbos. I'm a single parent. I'm home with my kids. Just send John Miles over. And John Lewis's son spent the summer with me from Friday to Sunday. And when John was sworn in, Lillian Lewis and I were in the balcony, and our boys were sitting on John Lewis's desk. On his knee. I'll give you one other quick story. Over the years, we did lots of Black Jewish Coalition meetings at the King Center. Mrs. King, Coretta was often there. And one time I said, we were looking for the next meeting date. And I said to Coretta, I can't do that date. I'm going to Russia. I'm going to meet with refuseniks, Soviet Jews. And she said, come by my office before you leave. And when I did, she had autographed 3 books. Her story of continuing Dr. King's work after he passed away. And she said, I want you to bring them to women in the Soviet Union who are continuing their husband's work when their husbands are in prison. And I did that in 3 cities. And I actually spoke at her funeral and told that story. So, those are, and Congressman Lewis and I just developed a lifetime relationship, and did a lot of things together.
It's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Reverend Wilson, I'd like to talk with you for a few minutes. Can you share some of your feelings and knowledge of how the church leaders, and Jewish rabbis fit into the civil rights movement?
Well, I think the faith leaders were instrumental in making that march from Selma to Montgomery. If you remember, Bloody Sunday occurred, and it was not until people of all faith traditions decided to bond together, and it was in large measure the Jewish rabbis, the Greek Orthodox Church, when the protesters on the other side, the police, could not spray those faith leaders with the water hoses. They could not ride the horses over the faith leaders, because across the front lines, you saw the presence of God in many forms, and they just could not consciously move against them. And I think that that bond, and we've seen it carried from decade to decade, has been able to move us forward in the midst of some really tumultuous times. It was faith leaders that encouraged young people to engage in the freedom rides and to participate in the voting voter education and the voting rights demonstrations across the South and in many instances in the North. I think that there's been an unusual bond between Blacks and Jews across the years as we wrestled with, struggled together against discrimination and in particular hate crimes. That has been one common thread in our mutual history, whether it was the Klan burning crosses on lawns of Black people, or Jewish worship centers, temples being bombed, firebombed, and Jews being treated differently, just engaging in basic commerce, owning businesses and trying to operate. And so I think that our common history has forced us to see our common destiny was intertwined and that we saw a common struggle with each other.
Thank you. We'll be coming back to part of this question because of some of the issues of the present and the future, so we will be returning to it. When we spoke recently, Reverend Wilson, you mentioned also that there are some areas where past generations connected and understood common bonds, while you did express that you feel that current younger people and certainly youth may not see the common grounds. You had some suggestions how to repair and build bonds. Can you share some of these?
Well, I spoke with Reverend Jackson before coming on this program, and one of the things we talked about is, he said, common legacies require you to see common challenges. When you see you are challenging the same situations together. Most recently, prior to COVID, I don't know if you remember, they were bombing Jewish temples and trashing Jewish temples and synagogues. At the same time, they were bombing Black churches. They were invading prayer services like they did in South Carolina. Those instances of hate, unrestrained, unrestricted hate, caused us to bond together. I joined with a rabbi from Chicago, just in the Chicagoland area. We did what they've been doing in Atlanta for years. Our interfaith coalition joined with the rabbi at Isaiah Temple in Chicago, which was originally KAM Temple, where Rainbow
Isaiah Israel, yeah.
Right, and we met together, prayed together, but also stood together in press conferences saying that you cannot destroy the temple without a response from us. Similarly, the Jewish rabbi stood with us and talked about what happened in South Carolina and other Black churches. And so as we started to work together, we began to review some of the history of Black-Jewish relations. All of us were old enough to remember, or at least had read about Rabbi Joshua Heschel and how he said his feet were praying when he marched across that Edmund Pettus Bridge. And so we have history of Schwerner Goodman and Cheney. When we remember that history and then we see it repeated in the present, it's just a powerful thing. And I think we have to teach our children, we have to tell the story. To have an African-American Jewish Seder during Passover, because there's a common thread. We all celebrate, remember the Exodus, whether it was from our slavery or your slavery, it's our slavery. And so as we remember our past, recall, reconnect the bones of our past, it will help shape our unity in the present and the future.
Can I just add something to that? Is since you mentioned Reverend Jackson, Rabbi Sugarman, he was the rabbi after Rabbi Rothschild that you see in the movie. Rabbi Sugarman worked closely with Hosea Williams. And one of the stories that didn't get into the film was when Hosea Williams was actually on his deathbed, he was holding Reverend Jesse Jackson's hand and they were praying together over him. And when Rabbi Sugarman tells this story, tears really come down. So, sometimes we hear bits and pieces of stories, but these personal stories, the more we have them documented, they really become important, to inspire.
All of them were young people. And all of them were young people. These were not old people marching. These were not old people that were challenging the bastions of hostility in our government. And so it should be an encouragement to young people. Black Lives Matter. It was a coalition, however, that brought success, because by ourselves, we're marginalized. We're seen as them. But when we come together, Blacks and Jews united, it was a force that could not be denied or distracted. It was an unusual bond that we must regain. It's a powerful force for change.
And I think that religious leaders can both inspire and calm down some of the people, some of the feelings, some of the things that come alive in us as we see the treatment. And
well, I think our faith dictates our behavior, and so there's something that will keep us focused on the ultimate goal, as opposed to being distracted by the taunts from onlookers or from those who would have us respond to them as violently as they are reacting to us. It was faithful people led by faithful leaders that got them across that bridge without an incident and without people reacting. I mean, can you imagine the horror that they felt when John Lewis was hit in the head and skull cracked? I mean, the people were talking about how they heard the horses, they heard the gunshots, but the faith people could keep that force going in spite of everything that was happening. And you can't do that kind of work without a faith tradition, I don't believe.
I have two quick stories. When John, when we started the Black Jewish Coalition, 2 years later was the 20th anniversary of the march across the Selma Bridge. We decided we would go back there, and Rabbi Sugarman, who Sherry just mentioned, was the rabbi of the temple, and we were going to have a bus. There were buses leaving the King's Center and the Black universities, but we wanted a bus to leave from the temple, and Rabbi Sugarman said he wanted us to start at the temple, have breakfast there before we headed to Selma, because he wanted to retell the story of the temple bombing that happened in 1987, because the rabbi Rothschild spoke out about civil rights. But anyway, Rabbi Sugarman went with us, and picture this: we're at the top of the crest of the bridge, and John Lewis is up front, arm in arm with Rabbi Sugarman, kind of a renewal of Dr. King and Heschel. And they kneeled to pray, as you saw in the film Selma. They need to kneel to pray at the crest of the bridge before they walk down. But Rabbi Sugarman tells the story with tears in his eyes. Just picture 20 years ago, they faced the billy clubs and the water hoses and the dogs and the horrific, threat to life. And he said, now 20 years later, we look down and the world press is there. So never lose hope that we've made progress. I thought that was, and then for me as a Georgian, to see the coalitional tie that our two senators have, Ossoff and Warnock. I mean, neither would have won without the other, and they ran so hand in hand and up front with the Black Jewish Coalition is alive. And when the Senate voted, for the COVID relief, everybody was really praising them because they were the deciding two votes.
Right.
Had Georgia not won, we wouldn't have turned the Senate. So I just feel that was like the icing on the cake to Sherry's film, that you can look back and you understand the history, but you can look forward and see some unbelievable lights on this legacy.
Well, when you see Rabbi Frederick Reeves, who was in Atlanta, is now in Chicago, leading the same kind of coalition he was a part of in Atlanta. And I mean, he's young, he's at the temple where Push bought the original temple where Dr. King spoke. So it's a Kairos moment, and everything happens in the fullness of time.
Yeah, I have a question for anyone on the panel. to answer, because I think it's something that we all want to know. What are some of the differences in activism that you see moving forward, ways that marches and other forms of activism will look? And as at some point in this question and answer, I'd like to address how religious leaders can have a role in this. But this is open to anyone on the panel. What are some of the differences in activism that you see moving forward?
Isn't there some young people? And there's two people.
There are.
Rudy.
There are. So
Yeah.
yes.
So Rudy, that's your question.
I see a lot of lines of correlation, to be honest. I see a lot of coalition building that's continuing to happen, especially on the grassroots level when it comes to direct actions and protests, and a drumbeat of radical progressivism, to be honest. For example, Chicago Vote does a lot of work with young people all across the city. And we've started a tradition with the Jewish Council for Urban Affairs, there's Youth Summer Fellowship. We do voter registration trainings and canvassing with them on a summer basis. And it beckons back to that same blueprint as the movie specifically quotes. There's a blueprint and we just need to teach it. I believe that that's happening. You can see that at direct actions and protests, young people from diverse backgrounds, both Black and Jewish, coming together to fight for causes to make Chicago and Illinois a better place for everybody. The things I'm seeing that look a little bit different is the issues are even more radical and even more progressive. When you speak to the terms of abolition, it's not just the abolition of slavery, it's not just civil rights, it's the abolition of prisons, it's the abolition of police. And so you see us moving towards more radical concepts and prospects, because this generation is the most progressive generation that this globe has ever seen. And you can see that coming through in the issues that they come together to fight for. And it's very exciting to see, in my opinion.
Some others from the panel before I...
Well, I'm inspired by this generation of young people because, at some point we thought, who's going to take the mantle? Who's going to take the baton? Mm-hmm. And, I often tell people, you can't take the baton unless you're in the race. And I'm not giving it to you unless you know the rules and you are running faster than I am. And so when I saw the movement of Black Lives Matter, I was just inspired. And it didn't stop with just marching. It marched straight to the polls and delivered, particularly in Georgia. Young people turned out in such record numbers. It transformed the whole community of the state of Georgia, and it reverberated around the country. I'm just so impressed with the impact and the intelligence and the way they've used this social media, which we did not have. We were still running mimeograph machines. So, we didn't even have fax machines. I'm telling you.
And it's important who we bring to the table, that we create opportunities to bring young folks to the tables. I just am in awe of Stacey Abrams. And absolutely. I have to tell you, I first, talk about a story we did. I met Sherry when the American Jewish Committee was doing our biannual Black Jewish Young Leaders Retreat, 18 Blacks, 18 Jews, spending 24 hours together in a retreat center. And Stacey Abrams was at that retreat. Wow. Stacey went on to be the chief legal counsel for Shirley Franklin and when Shirley was mayor of the city of Atlanta, and look where Shirley is now. You just don't know who's young you're going to put at the table that's going to absolutely change the course of history. John Lewis, look, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, it was a kid.
Yeah.
Spoke at the March on Washington.
Do you think that as the response, like the police response and some of the responses and some of the crowd response in some of the marches, some of the looting, some of the things, do you feel that religious leaders have an important role of being part of that front line to slow down the response, the violent response of the police and so on? Would there still be the respect for religious leaders if they marched in front?
I think it's different today than it was then. You have to be in relationship with the marchers. You can't just run in front of the line and say, we're here. We had a situation in Chicago where young people were shutting down the Magnificent Mile on a Good Friday. And several of us they had marched the night before. We called and made sure that they were able to be released from jail and all sorts of things. So the next day, several of us seniors, as I'll put it, decided we're going to march with them for their protection. And so one young man ran up to us in the line and said, "Where were you last night?" And so I said, "We were protecting you, making sure that you could get in and out of jail, that you didn't know you were going in. We made sure you had bond money. But also, the question I have for you, where were you 40 years ago? Don't ever challenge our presence. Whenever we're here for you and for your future. We're not here to stop you. We're here to make sure that the forces that are against you don't attack you, because when they see us, they see a different level." And so it was revealing to me, but it meant we have to be in coalition and in partnership so that we know each other. Now, the same young people, they know us, they come to us, and they understand, I'm not trying to stop you from demonstrating. I just want to make sure you have a point, and that as lawyers, we know you need legal protection at all times, because the law enforcement officials are not with you always. And that is what we saw this in the 60s, you see it now. It's worse in many ways. When those people stormed the Capitol, they did it acting under color of law and with the complete complicity of many police officers. That's a dangerous move. And you all remember in the 60s, the same kind of thing happened. The people under those sheets were police officers, sheriffs. They were not just ordinary citizens. And that's where we are again today. And I know Chris knows this and Sherry knows this. So,
yeah.
And you know, they're different. Go ahead, Chris.
No,
I was going to say they're different voices. You know, back then there were more singular, you know, Martin Luther King kind of was a singular voice.
right.
And clergy had amazing power, you know, in the pulpit. But I remember I used to go, Mrs. King used to have us go back every 5 years to reenact the March on Washington. And I sat with an old timer who was an AJ, American Jewish Committee staff member, Hyman Bookbinder, we called him Bookie. And I would sit with him and he said, you know, I was here at the first march and they only let Black folks speak, and they didn't let anybody who was in elected office speak, and they didn't let women speak. You know, Dorothy Height, who organized, was the national president of the National Council of Negro Women, galvanized everybody to come, but didn't let her speak. You know, and he said 5 years later, now they're Blacks that are in elected office and Blacks are speaking. And, you know, now they're women are speaking, you know, so things have changed. And I think about the fact that today, Black Lives Matter, there's not one central voice, there are many voices. And today there are other folks, there are people in business and sports. My God, the role that the athletes are playing in this Get Out the Vote campaign. And you know, so that there are many voices that I think of power and influence that weren't there before, that add to the you know, to the level of involvement.
Thank you. I want to move to Chris now, because one of the basic needs before we can move forward into other things is we have a basic need of housing, safe, secure housing in neighborhoods that have a together kind of feeling. And in talking with you, Chris, you shared with me that while you are passionate about fair housing and legal issues, you said that you learned much from the film. And I wondered if you could share one or two things you learned and address how we can take these lessons that we learned from shared legacies and apply them to the civil rights issues of today, especially in the greater Chicago area.
Sure. So one of the biggest issues the biggest lessons really that I learned from the film was empathy. The reason for the success of the coalitions in during the civil rights movement was this shared history, this shared empathy, this being able to put yourself in the shoes of another person. And that, in my opinion, is almost as powerful as the letter of law. It forges these coalitions and makes them personal. Um, and that is, in my opinion, the key to creating those coalitions and building those bridges as we go forward. And building off of what Reverend Wilson said, we need to look at those common challenges as well between from the older generations. For the young generations, we need to find those common challenges. But what we also need to do is we physically need to come together. And coming at it from a housing angle, where I am coming from, people in this country are segregated. We don't see each other enough, especially in Chicago, one of the most segregated cities in the country. We need to have communities where we're rubbing elbows with different cultures, with different people who don't look like us. We need our Latinx kids going to school with Muslim kids. We need our Black kids going to school with Jewish kids. And only by doing that can we create that shared empathy, that understanding the pain and the suffering that an oppressed people can go through. So it's really, we need to start addressing segregation. Housing discrimination still occurs today. People are being held out of areas of opportunity. And we need to be able to see the challenges that other people are facing, especially when it comes to systemic racism and housing. So that's one of the lessons that I learned, is that we need to understand where everyone's where the suffering is, and then work together to address it.
Chris, I would just add also the overcoming and the working together. The suffering is what lit the fire, but also we should take pride in what we did accomplish together on many different levels. In terms of legally, politically, you think of even the Mayor Bradley, actually in the early 70s. That was the first Black mayor in California. There was a huge coalition. So political coalitions, and we're hoping someday to do shared legacy days, you know, whether it's around sports, whether it's around, you know, to have these shared legacy day with the NAACP. You know, many folks don't realize one of the most important awards that's given every year by the NAACP is in honor of Joel Spingard, who was a Jewish man in the early 1900s, who was one of the co-founders. So, and you know, all these shared legacies can be then revitalized, and then there can be this kind of emotional connection, not only from the shared pain, but also from what we achieved together. You know, another story that I think of when I interviewed Ambassador Young is he said, not only was Rabbi Rothschild and Mrs. Rothschild involved in Dr. King's dinner and everything, but Mrs. Rothschild's mother would have him for dinner and would help him with the campaigns. So in Atlanta, they have even a history going back that a lot of folks don't even know about. So every single one of these stories, whether Rabbi Funay, who's in Chicago, and of course, Black Jews are very much at the forefront of this conversation all over the country. But, you know, Chicago has amazing positive stories of working together, of course, with Reverend Jackson and all throughout the country. We need all these stories documented. The good, you know, also the positive is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And I do want to add that your film did an amazing job covering those successes, especially for a person like myself. I'll go ahead and admit, I only learned the bigger picture of the civil rights movement growing up, and I didn't really know how involved the Jewish community actually was. And so your film did an amazing job really drawing out those eyewitness accounts and all those small personal stories that I love, that the details of history are the most interesting.
Thank you.
You know, Chris, two of the things that you said really resonate with me. One is about empathy, and the other is about physically getting together. And when I think of us in the midst of a pandemic, and I think also about the 4 years that we just came out of with the leadership in the country, empathy and physically getting together. These are two issues that I think we need to really be embracing and figuring out as we come out of this. How do we make up for lost time and for moving backwards with some of it? So I thank you for bringing those terms up. Do any of the other panelists want to address some of this about taking lessons from shared legacies and applying them to civil rights issues? Rudy, could you address this for us?
Absolutely. I think that, as I referenced before, having really deep coalition work, especially on the ground and the grassroots, is really, really important. Making sure that when folks are on the ground engaging with folks face to face, that you're doing so across racial lines, bringing young people from different experiences into different cultures and into different neighborhoods so that folks can meet and really build that deep relationship that's required to sustain movement. But also in policy reform. I think that's another huge area. I'd love to uplift, specifically, Nancy, the National Council for Jewish Women and their involvement in the Just Democracy Coalition here in Illinois. It is a group of folks that come together to modernize our democracy and make sure that the most vulnerable have access to the ballot box. And I think that, especially when it comes to the future of this movement, we're working to bring voting in prison to Illinois. We think it's really important. That's what Chicago Votes is working towards. There's actually a bill right now that's going to be heard on Monday in committee, HB 1872, that is all about making sure that our most directly impacted and most vulnerable, specifically in the Black community, have access to the ballot. And I think that's one issue that we can continue to grow together as a coalition to work towards, especially as abolitionists.
Thank you. It's pretty scary as we are seeing some of the things that we have held as just simply givens, that we're seeing pulling back on voters' rights. So Rudy, you've been a leader in getting young people out to vote. What stories of the past resonate with you and help you get young people to vote today?
One of the stories that really invigorates me and something that Chicago Votes afforded me as a young organizer back when I was just learning was the importance of the Mississippi Freedom Summer back in 1964. I had the honor of going to Tougaloo College in Jackson to celebrate the 50th anniversary as a young organizer, meet folks from both Black and Jewish backgrounds who are part of those voter registration efforts, and then bring that energy back to Chicago to engage in voter registration work at the place that I work now, Chicago Votes. And that to me was a really pivotal experience that helped inform the importance of voter registration, the importance of getting young people excited about being engaged in the electoral process, specifically on the local level where they are from. Because the strategy of going to these small local towns and getting folks registered to vote and making sure that folks are doing so in coalition for safety purposes and also just for the greater movement is an inspiration that we can continue to do here today. And like I mentioned before, we partner with the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs to bring that connection together even now in the summertime to make sure that young people understand the importance of voter registration, understand the rules and regulations here in Illinois of how to do that, and then use that as a foot in the door to get young people engaged civically in other issues.
And to run for office.
Absolutely.
So
young people in office.
Yeah, there was a comment from the audience that we have to maintain and expand the coalitions for the next elections. We have to make sure that local and state elections are given the due importance. Just see the voter suppression laws now being discussed and approved in some states. It's really It's scary. And so we're turning to you, Rudy, to help us see that this happens. The turnout of young people, do you see it increasing? Do you see?
Absolutely. Actually, statistically, over the past 5 years, young people between the ages of 19 and 25 have steadily increased in voter turnout, specifically in local elections here in Chicago and on the state level. And in the past election in Illinois, young people between the ages of 19 and I believe it was 34 were the largest voting bloc in Chicago. They outvoted their parents. And so that's amazing. When you think about that change and participation, you can see that young people care. You can see that they're making the connection between hitting the streets and having their voices heard at direct actions and protests, and then also having their voices heard at the ballot box, and understanding that cyclical motion, that you have to do both, that voting may not just be the only answer. You also have to hit the streets. You also have to communicate with your legislators and hold them accountable after they get into office, and make sure that you're an active participant in your community. So that's really, but what I see as the important elements here is making sure young people are voting, and then after they vote, making sure that they are holding folks accountable in office and having that continued relationship and action.
Thank you.
Well, you have in Georgia, we have, though it's about to get killed, I think, with that horrible legislature. When you register for your driver's license, you can at the same time register to vote. I don't know whether you have that. And also in high schools, when you're in your senior year, you can register to vote through the high schools. Because we had that ridiculous long runoff in Georgia, we think that the people who turned 18 between November and January that were able to vote could have been the margin of victory too.
They were.
Sherry, can you tell a little bit about Congressman Lewis before he passed away, how he formed the caucus in Congress that had never, the Black Jewish Caucus?
Yeah, the American Jewish Committee has done some really remarkable things. I retired 15 years ago, so I can't take credit for this, but Dov Wilker, who's the director and has been the director almost for 10 years, helped initiate a new Black Congressional Caucus. It's the first time there's been one, which is really quite exciting. And the other thing, and of course, Congressman Lewis was part of it and was a founding member, but there's a large number of Black and Jewish members of Congress now, and so they are a mighty voice now, particularly added with Ossoff and Warnock. But also the National Urban League and the American Jewish Committee have formed a partnership in every city that there's a junior American Jewish Committee chapter. They're usually called Access. And wherever there's a junior Urban League chapter, they work in partnership. So that's another group that you can pull together. And you know, through the years in our Black Jewish Coalition, you know, we met for lunch, but we met in the early evening, but we really shared a lot of things. You know, we would have sessions on Black ties to Africa and Jewish ties to Israel. And we would have sessions on what are the priorities in the Black community and what are in the Jewish community. And often tell the story, you know, African Americans would say mass incarceration and, you know, housing discrimination and redlining in banks, and Jews would say anti-Semitism and intermarriage. And it was like, my goodness, our issues are so different. Why are we at the table together? You know, and we looked at each other because we're still the first avenue for hate and bigotry and bias. We still are an endangered minority. And when we strip away these priority issues, we are madly working for social justice, for equality for all, for fair pay, for women's rights, for reproductive freedom, for justice, for gun safety. You know, once we've talked about the things that aren't on each other's priorities, the list of what we care tremendously about is enormously long.
So I think that as faith leaders began to wrestle with this, and this is one of the things that Reverend Jackson and the Rainbow Coalition, we have been intentional about preserving the relationship. There's enough hate in America to keep us bound forever until we can eradicate this hate. I mean, when you have people bombing synagogues and burning churches and shooting people during prayer service or Bible study, that's an automatic bomb. People bombed around common issues of survival. And and this voting is important because when you see Ossoff winning in Georgia and Warnock winning the first time ever in the state of Georgia, that says a lot for those 11 southern states that discriminated against Blacks and Jews historically, and the power that those two young men going to the Senate, what that means for us. Similarly, that Georgia state legislature needs to change. There's an impetus for change now, given the struggles. You had to have a runoff election. In Illinois, part of the reason these young people are turning out, they're also running for state offices and winning. So I think that the coalition can reform now more than ever because it's enough pressure for us to be together. We need to have these shared conversations, because if I don't know your struggle, I don't know your history, I'm not necessarily going to be willing to have you in coalition with me. But once I understand what we have accomplished together, I'm like, oh yeah, we need to do this. When you understand what happened with the various rabbis across the South who put life and their temples at risk. Many of them had to leave and go to New York or go north to survive because they were threatened by their own members out of fear. And so I just think once the generations understand the rich history we've had together and what that power could represent, it's easy to form a coalition. Women in Chicago are working together across lines. Coalition of Women to Win, and the Women's March, Chicago, which was unbelievable. It was Black and Jewish women that really came together. Marilyn Katz and some other Jewish women and Black women coming together.
Oh, I'm on the board of Women's March Chicago, so yes.
Yeah, Women's March Chicago. It was that Black women and Jewish women coming together, and we brought the rest of the women with us, but it was that coalition. We didn't focus on being Blacks and Jews. We're going to change this now. We got to fight for better education for all children.
Yeah. One of the things I love about this panel is that they go in the directions that I didn't even have to ask the question. So I'm going to tell you what direction you answered, and then I'm going to ask a question, and that was, what are some things that give you hope? And I think that we heard many examples of things that give us hope. And I want the audience to hear the word hope, because I think that it's important that our panel feels that there is hope. But this does lead to something that some of us on the panel had a bit of a discussion about, and I think the audience will appreciate it. And that is, how do you keep hot issues, significant issues of differences, from overtaking building bridges? As a matter of fact, there even was a question asked by someone in the audience, and the question had to do with that, that some things that have happened seem to be stopping the connections and between Black people and Jewish people. And so I'd like to know from the panelists, I know Sherry Frank, you addressed that in a really concise way the other day, how you keep hot issues, significant issues of differences, from overtaking building bridges. Would you share that? And then I want to hear.
Yeah, I think we have to acknowledge, on the one hand, there's racism in the Jewish community and there's anti-Semitism in the Black community. I mean, neither of our communities are totally clean and clear, nor is the human race. We all have some bias of some force, but when the issue of the Palestinians is raised as an issue that can be divisive, I tend to say, first of all, I'm always open to speak about Israel and the Palestinians in the Middle East, but I think we do it once we have some trusted relationships. It's not where we start our relationship. And number two, I think that, you know, when some folks will raise it, I'll often say, I'm glad to talk about it, but let's, you know, let's set a date, or let's have coffee, or let's, you know, let's not have it a quick discussion. This really needs a little bit more time, and let's do it one-on-one. And the other thing I often say is look, I've criticized the United States for years under Trump. It doesn't mean I don't love my country. I can criticize the policies of Netanyahu and still love Israel. So I think that we sometimes have to kind of set the policies of a government from the state, you know, separate. And then, you know, when people say, oh, well, there's anti-Semitism in the Black Lives Matter, my response to that is I believe that 99% of the people on the streets are demonstrating against incarceration and police brutality and racial injustice, and they don't give one darn about the Middle East. So let's not take the few people carrying banners about the settlements and think that speaks for all of Black Lives Matter. It's just not fair. It's just like any one of us doesn't speak for all of us. There's diversity in the community, and that's and I also say, you know, I remember a rabbi in Atlanta, when asked about the question of Black Lives Matter, he said, you know, Blacks are in prison, and that matters to me much more from my conscience as a rabbi than a few people holding anti-Israel signs in a rally. You know, lives are at stake when Blacks are incarcerated unfairly. And he said, my conscience tells me to just, you know, set aside the anti-Israel placard and, you know, go get somebody out of jail.
I think that to your point, our organization, following Reverend Jackson, who was following Dr. King, said need is the basis of organization. Self-interest is the sustaining force, and service is power. People come together around a common need, and they can work together when their self-interest is at stake. And so whether it's Black Lives Matter or the Jewish Council, we have to have a need and a self-interest that we're working towards. So that's why I keep going back to the churches and the synagogues being attacked. When you see people, when they saw George Floyd murdered on television by a white police officer, it didn't take much for people to say, this is wrong. Just gonna murder a guy for nothing. He hadn't killed anyone, he hadn't done anything, but just some cop decided it's your day, and I'm gonna be the judge, jury, and executioner on the street. That galvanized Blacks and Jews in ways that words could not. They just saw the visual. That was Selma. When they saw, or in Montgomery, when they saw those kids being attacked by the police with water hoses, that dealt with the conscience of America. The soul of America was on fire. So there was a need to respond. And I think that we're at that point now. When people saw what happened in the Capitol, your ideologies went out the door. Your biases, that was just flat out wrong. It was reminiscent of secession, post-Reconstruction. I mean, all of that. So I think that it's need is the basis of organization. We're going to organize because we have a need to. Our self-interest, our viability individually and collectively is at stake. And so our coming together will help us work it out, I think.
Chris, can you address how you see this also? How you can keep some of the hot issues, significant issues of difference from overtaking, building bridges?
Sure. I guess I would just refer back to what I mentioned earlier, is we have to keep people in close proximity to one another. We need to maintain open lines of communication. And kind of like Sherry said, of course, there's going to be some people who are saying maybe anti-Semitism, but that is not representative of the whole population. So yeah, I think we just need to maintain open lines of communication and stay together.
Thank you. I know that someone in the audience commented on the Native American community, as well as the Muslim community and the Asian community, are now also experiencing racism. And I think that one of the points that has been made today and has been made in some of our discussions is the topic we're especially dealing with today is the Jewish and Black coalition. But one of the things is that as you reach out and get together and experience empathy, it's reaching out and seeing the common grounds and pulling in from the Native American community, the Hispanic community, the Muslim community, the Asian community, that certainly the same kind of hatred and fear are segregating and rearing their ugly heads on those. I have a couple of questions. One is, so many in our audience are women. And there have been some discussions about how women will influence building bridges. But I'd like to ask the panel if you have some ideas, some of all of you or any of you, on how women will really influence and can influence building these bridges.
Well, in Atlanta, we've had a women's dialogue, a group of 6 Black women and 6 Jewish women that have been together. We actually, on the 10th anniversary of the Black Jewish Coalition, we had a dinner in the evening, and the next day folks said, you know, it was a great dinner. The men enjoyed it. They went home, went to work the next day, but the women, they were fired up. You know, it wasn't enough to stop with that one event. And now 30 years later, our women's group, our group of 12 still meets. We don't meet as often as we used to. A few have retired and moved out of town, but we still do Zoom meetings, and we always get together in December for a holiday dinner. But we traveled to Israel together. We traveled to Washington we went through, spent a couple of days in Harlem. We went to the Holocaust Museum in Washington. So we've done some amazing things together, and you know, shared. There's a group that's just starting in Charleston. I spoke at one of their film meetings, and they said they've got a group of women together, and the first thing they're doing is reading the book Caste and discussing it. You know, in Atlanta, one of the things we've done for a lot of us white folks, we don't really know. Chris, you said there was a lot about the Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement. A lot of us white folks really don't know the depth of some of the racism and Black issues, and so we got a group to see the Netflix documentary 13th. You know, about, I mean, that was just a history that, you know, we need to educate each other. And I remember through the Black Jewish Coalition, we often would see a Spike Lee movie and talk about it. I tell the story, we saw Driving Miss Daisy, and Jews were just so embarrassed with this Miss Daisy and how she treated her driver. And the Blacks said, we didn't even think she was Jewish. That was just the way white folks treated Black folks.
Right.
You know, it was just such an interesting discussion to share a movie, share a film, and talk about it and see how we see the same thing through different eyes. You know, those shared experiences. I mean, look, we did lots of marches, and we worked for the Martin Luther King holiday bill, and we worked to unmask the Klan in Georgia. I mean, you know, you look at 30 years and you've got lots of legislative issues we're working on. Right now, we're advocating, I can't believe that they're going to limit the weekend voting in Georgia so that the Souls to the Polls effort for Blacks to go from church to vote is going to be restricted in Georgia. I mean, we may have none, we may have one, but not 3 days. But, you know, our shared experiences of marching, of going to a movie, of reading a book, of watching a documentary, a shared experience builds a relationship.
I think women, since that powerful Women's March a few years ago that went global, women have formed relationships that have been sustained. I know in Chicago, we have Women to Win, Women's March Chicago, and CWTA. So all of the women's groups, the sororities and other women's organizations are meeting regularly. Everybody's reading Cass. And if they're not reading it, I'm telling you, read Cass, because it explains systemic racism and white supremacy in ways that we could not imagine when you understand the caste structures globally. So women have the capacity to build bridges because we have the ability to humble ourselves at times that seem inappropriate, because we can focus on the end game in ways that it's more difficult sometimes for men.
And you know, it's a work in progress. I mean, National Council of Jewish Women has as a priority reproductive freedom, justice, and health. But Sister Song, do y'all have Sister Song in Chicago? I mean, I'm just learning a lot about Sister Song, but it's a wonderful African American organization. Women and reproductive rights and all kinds of infant health mortality are in their agenda. And I want us to try to do some of our reproductive justice work with Sister Song so we can put Blacks and Jews at the table. We couldn't do it in COVID. We've done a little of it at Zoom. But those, you know, sometimes it has to be intentional. And like when you talk about a need, that's an issue. That's a need, reproductive freedom and justice. You know, so can we form a Black Jewish Alliance working on that issue? And so our work doesn't end.
Thank you. I'm going to stop this part for because I have two things where we have to wrap up. So the first thing is I want to ask Sherry Rogers to tell us what's next for you, Sherry. What are you working on now?
Well, what we're working on now is we have about 80 hours and that we have not used, that we're creating a video curriculum. So in contrast to just winning some big award for the movie, we are not throwing the footage that we have on the floor. We plan on using every bit of that footage so that, for instance, we interviewed Abe Maripal, whose parents were escaping Russia, the pogroms in Russia, who actually wrote the song. We interviewed the sons, the poem "Strange Fruit." So when he saw that disgusting pictures of the three men, the Black men being hung on a tree, he wrote that poem and then gave it to Billie Holiday. And all the interconnections, all the stories need to be told. And that's one thing, is the curriculum. Another thing is we're working on a shared legacy day, because I think we need to remind each other across the country of our shared legacies over and over again on a national level. And I was just thinking, you know, I just thought of this right now, and Sherry might be a little humbled by this, but, you know, we talk about Rabbi Heschel and Dr. Martin Luther King, as you saw Congressman Lewis say at the end of the film, that he would imagine they would be coming together for those generations to get on board. We need to give awards in honor of our late Congressman John Lewis and Sherry Frank. There needs to be a Sherry Frank and Congressman John Lewis Award, not because we're trying to only elevate them. What does that mean? What did Sherry Frank and John Lewis actually do? What, so they can learn it and they can stand in what they've done, because it inspires. I mean, it inspires. So we need to, those awards aren't just for the award's sake, it's for the knowledge, it's for the inspiration. So when you see Reverend Warnock get on CNN and he said Rabbi Heschel and Joshua King and Martin Luther King would be shining down, someday they will be saying Sherry Frank and Congressman Lewis will be shining down. We want women to identify with Sherry Frank and follow in her shoes.
I'm not going to even give you a chance to rebut that, Sherry. It is what it is. So we need to close right now. And so I think we've heard what's next for Sherry Rogers. We've heard about women's roles in this. We've heard what might be next for some of these groups. And what's next for us? Well, in the beginning, I said that some goals were that we would lead you this evening from the past to the present to the future, that we wanted you to come away with answers, with questions, with actions that you individually and collectively feel ready to take on. I hope that each of you who is attending tonight and the groups with which you devote your time, energy, and funding will continue to explore civil rights and work to believe in, continue, expand, and fund the coalition between African Americans and Jews, starting at the local level and expanding it beyond. Thank you to our panel, to our sponsors, and to you, our audience. Have a great evening, food for thought, and I hope that we will come together again, but even more, that you will come together and expand the meaning of this evening. Take care, everyone, and have a good evening. Thank you.